Our next guest joins us for a critique of how corporate media has covered post-pandemic inflation, and more specifically, the Fed's historic interest rate hike earlier this month. Professor Richard Wolff argues that most U.S. media falsely claims only Federal Reserve interest rate hikes can end inflation, continuing, quote, Nixon did it with a price wage freeze, FDR prevented it by his early 1940s rationing, media, government serves the 1% at the expense of the 99%.
Professor Wolff is a professor of economics and author of The Sickness in the System. He joins us now to expand. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you. So what do you think the media is getting wrong with the inflation discussion?
Well, they're doing the work of politicians in a way that I always was told the media isn't supposed to do. In other words, the Biden administration, with the complicity of the Republicans, is functioning, speaking, and acting as though the inflation is a kind of mystery that no one quite understands, fell in on us, number one, and that's a bizarre interpretation. And number two, that the only way to combat this evil, awful inflation is by raising interest rates. And that's flat out wrong. That's not economics. That's not what many of the people working in the Biden administration, some of whom I know personally, they know better than all of that. So this is a politicized political message, and it is leading Americans to believe that they are forced to choose between alternatives that are not, in fact, the only ones.
You said that they're behaving as though this inflation is a mystery, it just came out of nowhere, and I think that's true. What would you attribute the inflation to?
Well, I mean, the most important thing to remember is the simplest economics. Inflation is about prices. Who sets prices in the United States? The overwhelming majority of price increases over the last 12 months have been set by employers. That's a small class of the American people. Not even 1% of us are employers. Those of us who've been employees, the vast majority, probably noticed over the years that no one ever involved us in setting the price of whatever it is we helped to produce. That's done by the employers. So you have to face that reality and then ask the question, why might employers be raising prices? And we all really do know the answer. Every business school teaches it. These sorts of decisions, basic business decisions, are made to enhance the bottom line, to boost profits. All decisions are supposed to be governed in the end by that objective, and raising prices is no different. Many, many American employers have had a rough 2 years, no question, just like the vast majority of us. They want to make up for lost profits. The easiest, quickest, fastest way to do that is to jack up prices. And if the Federal Reserve and the government have been cooperative by flooding the economy with money, granted for other reasons, to keep us out of even worse depressions earlier this century, well, that only makes it even easier to raise the prices. But let's be honest, rather than quite so careful to protect the employers, they're the ones who made the decisions to raise the prices. And that's why we have an inflation. And the only remarkable thing, if you're honest about it, is why the solution or cure for the inflation so neatly avoids pinpointing who raises the prices and therefore who ought to be asked to take the compensatory steps to bring the prices down.
Well, they're raising the prices because, it's harder to ship things and get products out there, and there's the Ukraine and Russia issues driving up gas prices, the kind of supply chain issues, the pandemic, that kind of thing. So they're not, they're responding to some really bad conditions. Some of these conditions not under the Biden administration's control. Other conditions, like perhaps putting pressure on Ukraine to resolve the Russia conflict, could be a government policy that we're not really pursuing. But it's a mix of bad policy and bad luck, and I guess some kind of. But we'd have shortages, right? If you had the prices artificially kept low or by government fiat, which sounds like you're kind of suggesting is what we should do, right?
Right.
Absolutely. Let me push back just gently and in all due respect at what you said. Let's go with one of the many mysteries. But before we do, let me remind you that if I'm right, as I believe I am, and employers are raising prices to make a better profit story, which I'm quite clear they are, then one of the things they always have to worry about, if they're smart employers, and many of them are, is that they don't want to be held accountable. They don't want to be held responsible for what they've just done, namely boost their profits by raising their prices. So it behooves them to come up and flood the media with wonderful stories about everybody else who might be brought in and given some responsibility. So let me pick with the big one, the supply chain disruptions. And pardon me for smiling. It's just, I teach in the university and the students ask these questions. So I've been through this a few times. Every significantly sized business in America knows that it has to take care of the supply of its inputs, whether they come from 6 miles away or 6,000 miles away. The supply chain is a problem all the time. And every sizable business has personnel, usually called the purchasing department, and the purchasing managers whose job it is to anticipate and take the appropriate steps in order to accommodate supply chain disruptions, a bad storm, a snow emergency, a civil disturbance, a strike by workers. There's a list as long as your arm, which purchasing managers learn in order to take the appropriate steps, to have an inventory of things they may need if they're hard to acquire, to have alternative suppliers if your main ones are not available to you. That's their job. And if they don't do it, they get fired and replaced by people who do. In other words, supply chain disruption is a well-known, well-accommodated way of dealing with that kind of problem. To suddenly talk about the disruptions and to put on them the responsibility for inflation is really kind of counting on people thinking that there's something exceptional about supply chain. When you saw that ship, in the wrong position in the Suez Canal a year or so ago, we heard, and that was unusual because it was a bigger event than normally happens. We are not in a situation where suddenly the world is adrift in a vast explosion of supply chain difficulties. That was a very convenient excuse, as, by the way, would be Ukraine and Russia. All due respect, we in the United States have an economy whose GDP is about $21 trillion. Russia, the great other, has a GDP right now of $1.5 trillion. We're not talking a conflict in which they're in any position to fundamentally, economically threaten the United States, and they never were. The alternative is a kind of hyping which allows the key issue to deflect responsibility from the profit-driven inflation onto magical other things that we can then be upset about or propose policies for. But the real policy is what Mr. Nixon understood, a conservative Republican, and what FDR understood, a liberal progressive Democrat, which is if you want to stop or prevent an inflation, you can go directly to the issue, stop the employers from raising prices, and then deal with all of the adjustments that requires. I'm not arguing we should do it, but I am arguing that it's very strange in America that we talk only about interest rate increases and all the rest of it is swept under the rug.
Before I go, I think I just wanted to make sure I understand. I have a clarification on the exact rationale, right? My understanding, if I'm listening correctly, is we always have a profit industry, right? Where the employers are they're in determination of the prices based on a desire to make profit. That's always the goal. So if we're not saying it's Ukraine or Russia or anything now, what now in specific would you attribute it to why the employers or the people choosing the prices suddenly want to raise the prices much higher? What's the why, I guess?
Good. It's the past 2 years. many, many, many industries really took it on the chin over the last 2 years. They couldn't raise their prices. They couldn't even get many of their workers to the job. They discovered the very disturbing reality, which is that without workers, you're never going to make any profit. It ought to make you respect the workers. It doesn't work quite that way in our system. But nonetheless, they are having 2 years, 2020 and 2021, that they did very, very much less in the way of profits. They now want to recoup that. They want to recover, and that's the motivation to jack those prices up as quickly as they can.
Okay, so you're saying it's a good opportunity to do it now with all the Ukraine and Russia. It's a good opportunity for them to raise the prices, and the media is helping them do it. Okay, I understand. I understand what you're putting down, Professor.
All right.
Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Wolff. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.